Welcome everyone to my program, The Owls of Iowa. My name is Tony Vorwald. If you tuned in the other night for this exact program, unfortunately my computer screwed up and I lost the recorded file, so I'm recording the program again so everyone who is interested in seeing it can see it. So I'll share my screen and then we will get started. All right. So before we get going, just share a little bit about me. My name is Tony Vorwald. I'm a naturalist for Jackson County Conservation. And what I do is mainly I do educational efforts for environmental science, environmental education, natural resources education, conservation education, outdoor recreation, stuff like that. I also get to dabble a little bit in other conservation practices like land management and prairie restoration and plant science, different stuff like that. Also some really cool outdoor rec stuff like hiking and canoeing and leading youth trips. It's really cool. Here's some awesome pictures of me leading the rad life that I do. So like I said, I work for Jackson County Conservation. We are located in eastern Iowa along the Mississippi River, right below Dubuque County, right above Clinton County. And here's a picture of our nature center where my office is. That's a Hertzville Interpretive Center. This picture was taken on a nice, bright, sunny summer day with all the prairie plants in bloom. Right now, with it being so cold and snowy out, it makes me really excited for the warm season again. So here's a image of Iowa. The county that is in red is in Jackson County, just in case we're not familiar with all of our counties in Iowa. There's 99 of them. And there's even some of them that I've lived in Iowa the majority of my life, and there are some counties in Iowa that I'm not 100% sure exactly where they fall. If you are interested in staying up to date and current with the happenings of Jackson County Conservation, our different programs and events, you can visit jacksonccb.com. It has a list of all of our events. It has a list of all of our facilities and all of our properties. You can also follow the Hertzville Interpretive page on Facebook for all the events that we have going on. And you can also sign up for our monthly, or I guess quarterly, newsletter. Has pretty much all the happenings that we have to offer, and news too. All right, so before we dive into specific owls and their adaptations, I want to talk a little bit about taxonomical classification. So this is kind of some big science vocabulary here, but every species of plants and animals and bacteria and fungus and so on, every living thing you can fall into this taxonomical classification. And it starts off big and it goes down by different classifications that you can narrow down individual species by their scientific Latin name. So every living thing has a scientific name. We might know them by their common names, which are really cool. So like for owls, there's great horned owls, barred owls, screech owls, but each of these owls and each species has a Latin scientific name. And we'll be seeing that as the presentation goes on. But we order things in this taxonomical classification system by kingdom. Next group down is phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then species. So it starts off really big. It includes many, many organisms. We can start narrowing down these organisms by characteristics and traits down to who they're related to and what they actually are. So owls, they're in kingdom Animalia, so the animal kingdom, right? The next group that they're in is the phylum. And the phylum that owls are in is Chordata. So any animal that has a spinal cord is in the phylum Chordata. So owls, all vertebrates, humans, we have spinal cords, so we are in the phylum Chordata. Now we move down to class, and the class that they are is aves. So aves are birds. Any bird on Earth falls into the class aves. Now we go down to order, and we're getting a little bit more specialized here, a little more specific, and the order is Strigiformes. And Strigiformes, that is, those are owls in general. And there's two families of owls that we're going to be talking about. the Tytonidae and the Strigidae. So the Tytonidae is barn owls and the Strigidae is other owls. So then down from there, we get our genus, our species. So the individual owl species. So there's a little bit of science terminology for you all. So there are 9 species of owls that are considered native to Iowa. There are some other species of owls that are rare visitors to the state, but we don't really consider them a native species. But the owls that we're going to be talking about today: barred owl, the great horned owl, eastern screech owl, the northern saw-whet owl, the long-eared owl, short-eared owl, barn owl, snowy owl, and burrowing owl. So 9 of them. But before we dive into each individual species profile, I want to talk about adaptations. So every living thing has adaptations. And the way I like to think about adaptations are things that help a living thing survive. It's something that either physically has on its body or structure that helps it survive, or something that it does to help it survive. So something that it physically has might be its body shape, it might be it has feathers, or it has fur, or it secretes a certain mucus, something that helps it survive. It's very diverse in what an adaptation is. Or something that it does, like flying, like hunting in packs. That's a behavioral adaptation that helps it survive. So an adaptation is something that a plant or animal either physically has that helps it survive, or something that it does helps it survive. Okay, so the very first, so owls by and large share a lot of the same adaptations. They kind of and traits that make them similar to each other. The very first one that I want to talk about is facial discs. And let me turn on my laser pointer here. So right in front of us, we have this picture of a barred owl, and we can see its beak right here. It's 2 large black eyes. It's got a big round head, but we see these kind of like circular patterns in its feathers right around its eyes. Those are called facial discs. And that's a really cool adaptation that owls have. And what those facial discs do, they kind of serve 2 purposes. They kind of act as funnels. So if you looked at this owl in a profile view, you'd see that its facial discs are sort of concave. So owls, majority of them are nocturnal, and a nocturnal animal is active during the nighttime, sleeps during the day. And if an animal is nocturnal, it usually has pretty good vision at night. Owls, their eyes aren't like like night vision goggles that like, you know, a SWAT team or something would use, but they're a little bit closer to our vision at night. So like if I go walk out at night, it's really dark, it's hard for me to see, but I start walking and it's really, really dark, but eventually my eyes adjust, my pupils dilate, and there's usually a little bit of light out at night for one reason or another, either the moon or, you know, different things like that. And then if you're out at night, the longer you stay out, the better your night vision gets, and you actually end up seeing fairly well depending on the conditions. Owls are similar to that too. So they have really, so their eyes are really good at seeing at night, but those facial discs actually kind of work to funnel the little bit of light that's out at night directed towards their eyeballs. That helps them see even better. And also, those facial discs act as funnels for noise. So you can't see the owl's physical ear, but owls do have ears, but they're underneath their feathers, right? So we have these facial discs, and they actually kind of act as funnels for sound too for certain owls. So that's kind of cool adaptation. Those facial discs act as funnels for light and for sound. 2 important things that owls need to survive. Continuing on the conversation with eyes, owls have really large eyes for their relative body size. So the picture on the left here, this is a barred owl skull. You can see its beak, you can see the top of its skull, jaw bones here, its nostrils, but these 2 big circular parts, those are called the orbits, and that's where the eyeball would sit inside, right, and be attached to. If you look at that skull, the orbits are impressively big on it. So owls have massive eyes compared to their body size. And this picture of the owl on the right, that's a little northern saw-whet owl, and you can see its massive eyes compared to its body size. And those big eyes obviously help them collect a little bit of light that's out at night, so they have an easier time seeing and navigating. in darkness or at nighttime. Camouflage. So camouflage is an adaptation that the majority of a lot of animals have for one reason or another. And we think about camouflage like people going hunting, right? Like I like to go hunting, so I put, when it's deer hunting season, I put my camouflage clothing on. It's patterned to look like wood and leaves and the landscape, so I can go blend into the plant life around, so the deer that I'm hunting won't see me quite as easily. So a lot of animals, and owls included, have some pretty cool and sophisticated camouflage that's a part of their body form. So the image that we're looking at is a eastern screech owl. Right in the middle, you can see its eyes kind of peering, and it's sitting in the crevice or a hollow of a tree. We have all this gray and brown fissured bark around it. And we look at this little screech owl, its coloration is almost spot on for the coloration of this bark. On its breast, we have those like lighter colors. We have the darker bands and spackling. They have these ear tufts of feathers that come up that kind of look like the cracks of fissured bark. So owls, obviously, they want camouflage so they can hide and their prey doesn't see them. But owls also need camouflage so they're not bothered during the daytime. The majority of owls, they're sleeping during the day because they're more active at night or early dawn or right before dark. And if you're sleeping during the day and other animals like crows or other hawks, or maybe even other owls, you don't want to be seen during the day while you're trying to rest, trying to conserve your energy, trying to gain energy. You don't want to be bothered by other things, right? That would just make you expend energy, and then you would be worse for the wear. So owls, part of their camouflage is so they can be hidden during the day, right? So things that might bother them won't as easily. So the next adaptation of owls is they have some pretty interesting things that are going on with their feathers that help them aid in silent flight. So when owls fly, they fly silently. Now, I'm not talking like it's hard to hear them. Like when an owl is in flight, it's usually below the level of human hearing. So owls, how they do this is they have a couple very interesting adaptations with their feathers. So I couldn't find a good picture of this, and it's really hard to, you won't be able to see it on this photo. And it's even really hard to see it with the naked eye. You need like a dissecting scope and an owl feather to really get in there and look at it. But on owl's feathers, so we have this picture on the right, 3 owl feathers. Here's like the mid vein on the feather and all the little projections. If you zoomed in really close on those little projections, on the edge of each and one of those, there's a bunch of little things that look like eyelashes, and they kind of help muffle the wings and the feathers as the owl is flying through the air. So if you think of like other birds, other large birds, I'm going to use a Canada goose for an example. When a Canada goose flies, it's a big bird. It doesn't have these little eyelash projections on its feathers, and then it's flying. And if you ever heard a Canada goose fly, it sounds like a whoosh, whoosh, whoosh sound. They don't have these little eyelash projections. Their flight is not muffled. When an owl flies, they don't have that whoosh, whoosh, whoosh noise. All those little eyelash projections, help buffer the air so they can't fly. So they can't be heard while in flight. I'm sorry. Down here in the bottom, I have a picture of a soggy looking great horned owlet. So owls, so a lot of birds, you think back to the Canada goose, a lot of birds that interact with water, they produce such type of oil that they coat their feathers in to help keep them waterproof, so they can be buoyant on top of the water, but also insulate themselves and help keep the water from penetrating their outside of their feathers so they can keep warm. Owls, they don't have that secreted oil that they rub on their bodies to keep them waterproof. And the reason they don't have that oil is because if they don't have that oil, their feathers stay nice and fluffy and dry. So when they're flying, that kind of oily surface doesn't collide with the air and create a little bit of noise. So you can see this picture of this owl. It's all wet. It looks pretty grumpy. So sometimes owls, once they are wet, they can have issues with flight if they're wet because they don't have that protective oiling cover, and then they might be a little bit more susceptible to the cold that way. But they're still pretty downy and fluffy, and they do a pretty good job of staying warm. But they don't have that oily coat, those oily feathers like a duck or a goose might have. And the picture on the left, it's a close-up of a owl's feet. And that's really interesting as you look on these owls' feet and on their toes. Owls have feathers almost the very tips of their toes where their talons start. If I look at the majority of other birds' feet, say songbird's feet, a goose's foot, turkey's feet, or even other birds of prey like a red-tailed hawk or a bald eagle, their feet are naked and scaly. But owls, they have feathers all the way to the tips of their toes where the talons start. And we think that's because also to help muffle the noise. So when the owl's flying, even that little bit of exposed skin on a bird's feet creates just a little bit of noise. But with that extra feathers on it, it cuts down that noise. So the prey that the owls are hunting don't have a chance in hearing them. Pretty cool. All right, talons and beaks. All owls are birds of prey, which means they hunt and kill other animals to eat. And all birds of prey have pretty gnarly talons and beaks. So the picture on the left here, we obviously see these big, long, curl and pointy talons that owls use to catch and dispatch their prey. And here on the right is a profile picture of a great horned owl with its mouth kind of open, and you can see that long, curved, sharp beak that the owl is also going to use to kill their prey and tear up the meat as they're eating it. So another really interesting adaptation that owls have, they have the ability to rotate an outer toe on their feet. So on each owl foot, there are 4 toes, and with a lot of birds, 3 toes face forward. There's 1 toe that faces back. Owls have the ability for when they need to catch their prey or to perch, they can rotate one of their outer toes either backwards or forward, depending on what they're trying to do, perch, catch prey. And that helps give them a greater range of catching and holding onto their prey that while it's moving. So if you're an owl and you're a great horned owl, and you're chasing a rabbit, that rabbit's going to be probably, once you collide with it, it's going to try to get away, right? The better chance of you grabbing that food is going to help aid in your success. So that rotation of that toe helps the owl in a success with catching its prey and killing it. So we've all heard that owls can rotate their head all the way in a circle, 360 degrees, and look around. Owls can't quite turn their head all the way around. So in a circle, there's 360 degrees. If an owl could turn its head 360 degrees, its head would probably pop off. It's not physically possible. But owls can actually turn their head for about 270 degrees. So close, but not quite a full circle. So a human, we can kind of do like almost 180, like half of a circle, right? But owls, they can do 270. They have extra vertebrae in their neck that help them turn their head. And a reason why owls need to turn their head like that is owls, they have fixed eyeballs. So my eyeballs are human eyeballs. I can keep my head still, but I can look side to side, up and down. I can look at other things without moving my head. Owls, they can't move their eyes like that. They're fixed in their skull. So owls have to turn their head to look side to side, up and down. So if an owl hears something on its left, it can't just look over and keep its head still. It's going to have to turn its entire head over to look at what it's trying to see. One more really cool owl adaptation is its pellets. So most birds, they have a organ in their throat called a crop, and that's where they store undigestible food. So an owl, it's a bird of prey. It's hunting and killing other smaller animals that it likes to eat. And then once it eats that animal, it's going to end up swallowing things like bone and fur, things that it can't digest and things that aren't really nutritionally valuable to it. So the owl is going to store the undigested fur and bones in its crop. And eventually when it's ready, it's going to kind of puke up this little nugget that we call an owl pellet. So it's a picture on the left here. That's a picture of an owl pellet. You can see all these little white and gray bones kind of in the mix there. They'll have this gray paper mache looking stuff. That's going to be, a mixture of animal fur and mucus and saliva and whatnot. Here on the right, we have a picture of, it looks like some sort of rodent jaw that someone found inside of an owl pellet. So something that we do as an educational program with a lot of students is that we have owl pellets that we purchase from a distributor, and we go into a classroom, we talk about owls, and we let our students actually dissect owl pellets, and you can count the bones in it, see what kind of bones are in there, and sometimes you can even identify what species of critter that owl ate based on what you find in the owl pellet. Really cool. And sometimes if you kind of know where an owl is hanging out, where its nest is, you can find owl pellets on the ground in the wild. A little harder to find than ordering them online, but if you're ever interested, I'd say try to dissect one. Right, now let's jump into our species profiles. So how I have this set up, I have the owl's common name here. So the very first one, we're gonna start with a barred owl. Then next to it in parentheses is its scientific name. And then somewhere on the slide, I'm gonna have a range map, and that's gonna show where the owl is found in the United States or North America. And then I have our picture of the owl species we're talking about. The very first one is probably the most common one that I have in my area. I live in eastern Iowa, and the owl I hear and see most often is a barred owl. And a barred owl, I'm sure most of us are probably familiar with this call. It's the one that does the "who cooks for you" call, and we'll listen to it here in a little bit. And maybe a few of us might know it, remember that call. So the barred owl it's a pretty large owl. It's about 20 inches tall, give or take a little bit. Pretty fluffy, I don't want to call it rotund, but it looks kind of round, right? It's a big rounded head, has those big facial discs, has brown coloration, cream coloration, and has these kind of bars of white and brown on its breast, and these bars of brown and white on its tail. That gives it the name the barred owl. Some people confuse this with the barn owl, which we'll talk about later, but this is the barred owl. It's a year-round resident here in Iowa, so that means that we can find this owl in Iowa during all seasons: spring, summer, winter, and fall. It's not going to migrate great distances during seasonal changes. They might move a little bit, and local populations might move a little bit during seasonal change. Like during the winter, where I live in Iowa, we might get some barred owls that are found further north in the summertime, but we're going to see these owls here all year round. And it's pretty common to the eastern half of the United States. A barred owl likes to hang out in woodlands, deciduous forests. Deciduous forests are trees that lose their leaves in the fall, like an oak or a sycamore. That would be a deciduous tree, deciduous forest. Their habitat is that type of woodland. They like to nest in the hollows of trees. So you have a big mature tree, sometimes it's partway dead, sometimes it's dead completely. These deciduous trees, as they rot from the inside out, and then eventually a hole gets made for whatever reason. Maybe a woodpecker helps it along, and it continues to rot and create that and make a bigger hole. So barred owls, they nest in the hollows of dead trees, right? Barred owls mating, so when they start courtship and mating and laying eggs and all that, begins in March. So early spring is when barred owls start their mating, but you can hear barred owls doing their call all year round. Sometimes owls and other animals, they do certain vocalizations when it's close to mating time, but barred owls, no matter what time of the year, they will be doing that, their "who cooks for you" call, sometimes for territory, sometimes for other reasons, sometimes for mating. And their prey. So the word prey means an animal that a predator is trying to hunt and eat. So the prey is the owl's food. So a barred owl likes to eat small rodents, small birds, snakes, frogs, sometimes crayfish, sometimes even fish if it's available. So they're pretty generalist when they're looking for their food. If they can catch it and eat it, they're probably going to. But it's usually pretty small things, right? Though the barred owl is our second largest owl in the state, it's not really that big of a creature. Owls, they look bigger than they really are. They're mostly feathers and fluff and hollow bones. So a barred owl might only physically weigh a couple pounds, even though by looking at them, you'd think they weigh like 20 or 25, but they're pretty darn light. They need to fly, right? All right, so I'm going to stop my shared screen, and then I am going to share a video so we can kind of hear and see what a barred owl sounds and looks like. Okay. Let's back that up a little bit and hear it again. Very cool. So that is the call that the barred owl is known for. Owls, they have other vocalizations besides the common call that they're known for. But that's one you're going to be hearing during mating season for territorial reasons. It's probably the most recognizable and common owl call that we have here in Iowa. I'm going to jump back into sharing my screen. All right. So sometimes people are really good at mimicking owl calls. They can go out into the woods, hoot like an owl, and sometimes those owls will actually hoot back or even come in closer for a better look. I've had a little bit of luck calling barred owls. It's the only one I can actually do, but sometimes they're not not convinced. Sometimes they won't answer at all. I must have had an off night, right? Oh, I have to jump into a different screen. Sorry about that. Sometimes this Zoom screen sharing is a little bit clunky. All right. From current slide. All right. So the next owl we're talking about is the great horned owl. And this is the largest owl species that we have here in Iowa. They kind of get about 20 to 22 inches tall, so slightly bigger than the barred owl, but pretty comparable size. And great horned owls, there's a picture of them here right on the right. They are called great horned owls because they have these things on top of their head, and those are called ear tufts. All they are is feathers. They're not a physical ear, but they kind of look like horns on top of the owl's head. They're really big and pronounced. Other owl species have ear tufts, and we'll see a few of those. But when you see a great horned owl, you can really notice it, right? They have big yellow eyes. They're usually some sort of dark brown or gray speckled with white. Their color varies, and they're really common to the entire and the majority of North America. They're really variable in their habitat needs. So here in Iowa, they like woodlands, and they can also survive really well in open ground, prairie habitats, some agricultural systems. You can find them in the desert. You can find them in the east. You can find them where it's cold. You can find them where it's hot. Find them where it's dry, where it's wet. So they're really variable. But they like to nest also in the cavities of trees, hollows of trees, kind of like that barred owl. But they will also utilize nests of other large raptors, like other owls or red-tailed hawks, different birds of prey that will, find an unused nest or maybe even bully that hawk out of its nest for it to utilize. Owls don't really like to make their own nests the same way other birds might. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few other species. So this is actually the earliest mating and nesting, or the earliest nesting owl that we have here in Iowa, and it begins nesting as early as January, and laying its eggs. And the mating begins in the fall. The prey, very similar to the barred owl, but larger things than some of the owls that we're going to see. So like rabbits, skunks, squirrels, cats, other owls, hawks, even like things like porcupines. They're pretty generalist. If they can catch it and kill it, they're going to probably try to eat it. I think it's really amazing that they can attack and eat things like skunks. You know, who would want to eat a skunk? That'd be pretty tough one to try. But I am going to stop sharing this screen and we're going to jump over and we're going to take a listen to what a great horned owl's call is like, and it's noticeably different than the barred owl. Okay. So pretty different than the barred owl, right? Still hoots. Not all owls hoot, but this one is a lot lower. It's not as it's not that recognizable who cooks for you call the barred owl has. It's a little bit lower. To me, it sounds a little bit spooky, like something you'd hear on like a Halloween, like an old Halloween cartoon or something. But let's listen to it one more time. Pretty cool, right? And from current slide. All right, that is the great horned owl. The next we're going to move into is the eastern screech owl. So eastern screech owl is a year-round resident here in Iowa, but it's common to the eastern half of the United States. Eastern screech owls, they like woodlands, and there's more of abundance of woodlands in the east part of the United States than there is the west. I mean, I should say deciduous woodlands, the trees that lose their leaves in the fall. So eastern forest is what they like. And if you look at this picture that I have of the eastern screech owl, you see two owls sitting here. They're both eastern screech owls, but eastern screech owls, they come in a few different colors, and we call the different color variations in these birds, we call them morphs. So they come in multiple morphs. Usually there's a gray morph and like a reddish brown morph, but sometimes the gray can be dark gray, light gray, and sometimes the red morph can be rusty to darker brown. It varies between individuals, but there's a gray morph and a red morph. Like I said, their habitat is deciduous woodlands and even residential areas. There's a lot of owls that we see that utilize residential areas because cities and towns, a lot of times they have, they have large mature trees that the owls can nest in, and they're gonna still have things like rabbits and mice for them to eat, but maybe not quite as much competition from other critters that you would find in a woodland or a natural system. Their mating begins in April, so a little bit later than the first two owls, so in springtime, and they mostly prey on small rodents, mice, voles, things like that, and even insects. And like I said, they kind of come in multiple morphs, that red and that gray. The eastern screech owl, they also have little ear tufts, sort of like the great horned owl did, that helps aid them in camouflage. When they're sitting in a tree close to bark, it kind of breaks up their nice curved lines of their head, so they blend in really well to like cracked and fissured bark. And now let's take a second and listen to what the eastern screech owl sounds like. And the eastern screech owl sounds way different than the first two owls that we listened to. All right, so right at the very beginning, I know there's a lot of noise going on in this video, but that high trill kind of whinny, that's the eastern screech owl's its call. So listen to it one more time. And then you can see the owl peeking out of its hollow there, right? So this one, it's not hooting. It has that trill, that whinny. Back to the presentation. All right. Now we're going to start getting into owls that are not year-round residents here in Iowa. And the very first one is that we're talking about is the northern saw-whet owl. The northern saw-whet owl is a pretty little owl. So they do not get that big. They only get about 8 inches tall, sort of similar to the screech owl. I didn't mention it, but the screech owl is around 8 inches, maybe a little bit more. a little bit larger than the saw-whet owl, but only about 8 inches tall. Compare that to the 20, 22 inches of a great horned owl. Quite a big difference. So they're a winter visitor. So what that means is that during the breeding season, spring and summer, they're found more up north, the northern forests, the northern prairies. And then once winter comes in, it's harder for them to find food and water. And they'll come further south, like down here into Iowa, or where there's a little bit more available food and water. So if you look at their range map here, that purple color that we see, that's its year-round range. Up north in the mountains, that dark blue color is its winter range. And then that light blue is also its winter range, but they're a little bit more scarce down there in the wintertime. So their habitat is coniferous forest, so pine forest, not deciduous, but pine, and into some of that mixed forest and they swamps, riverland, things like that. They nest in they're cavity nesters as well. A lot of owls are, and they really like pines and cedar trees. We find a lot of saw-whet owls hanging out in the pines and cedars that we have down here in the Iowa down in the winter. And their prey, mice and small rodents. It's a pretty big commonality that you're going to see with different owl species. Here's a picture of a little saw-whet owl here on the right. It has those big facial discs, those big eyes. Usually has a brown coloration mixed with some white, grays, cream colored, different kind of colors that would blend in well into a forest. All right, next I'm going to play what a saw-whet owl sounds like. This video is just the audio with some images. There isn't moving footage of the saw-whet owl. And I love the saw-whet owl's call. It is not like any of the owl calls that we've heard so far. So here we go. So that sort of that little beeping that we're hearing, it kind of sounds like a skid, like a forklift backing up. That's the saw-whet owl's call. So it's not hooting like a great horned owl or a barred owl, and it's not giving a high trill like that screech owl, but it has this little fun sort of beeping call. Awesome. From current slide. All right. Next, we are moving into a larger owl, and this is called the long-eared owl. And as you look at its image here on the right, they call it the long-eared owl because it has really pronounced ear tufts, like the great horned owl does, like the screech owl does. It's not quite as big as our great horned owl. It's a little bit smaller. It's about tops about 15 inches. So it's about 5 inches comparatively smaller than our great horned owl. And it's really long, kind of slender. It doesn't seem as puffed out as our barred or our great horned owls. This is another winter visitor. So if you look at its range map, we have the orange color way up north. That's its breeding range. Down even to this purple, that's its year-round range. And then where we are at is in this dark blue. That's its non-breeding winter range. And further down in the southeast part of the country, that's its winter range as well, but it's a little bit more scarce. So this owl is coming in the wintertime because of for food availability and water availability, more than likely. This owl species, its habitat, is a little bit different than the ones we've already talked about. It really likes hunting in open land, so it's a prairie landscape. But it likes to nest in thick conifers or deciduous forest. It likes those spots where there are mature trees next to open ground. So it's going to hang out and nest and take refuge in those big trees, but it's going to hunt over open ground. And its nest, it usually takes over other animals' nests, like crows or other hawks and squirrels. It's going to utilize those animals' nests for its own. And its mating begins in late March, so in springtime, and its prey is pretty dependent on voles and other small rodents, right? All right, now let's take a second and listen to what the long-eared owl sounds like. All right, this one also is just of the vocalization. So we're hearing a few different noises in this. We have that high-pitched squeak that kind of sounds like someone um, carefully letting air, helium out of a balloon. That is the long-eared owl's call. But also in the background, you can hear a couple low hoos. They also hoot. They'll give a couple little hoots, low hoots, and they also have that high-pitched kind of nasally squeak. So let's keep listening. Cool. There's our long-eared owl's call. Back to the slides. All right, next is the short-eared owl. So kind of similar to the long-eared owl, it's only found here in the wintertime. And I'm actually going to back up again because I forgot to mention this, but we have the long-eared owl is state threatened. So its conservation status in the state threatened. We all have heard of like the endangered species list, right? So in the state of Iowa, there's different conservation statuses for all animals and plants, right? Some are of least concern. That means they're doing really well, probably pretty common, all the way to endangered. There's a few different categories in between. So the long-eared owl is listed as threatened. It's not all the way to endangered, but it's not a species of least concern. So there it has a special conservation status because their population needs a little bit of help, isn't doing as good as it used to, right? And that's also kind of similar with this, the short-eared owl. That one is listed as state endangered. So it is of a more severe conservation status than the long-eared owl. So here we look at, up here in the right-hand corner is our short-eared owl. It has little tiny ear tufts, probably why they call it a short-eared owl versus a long-eared owl. It's also pretty slender. It's roughly the same size as the long-eared owl, about 15 inches tall. And this owl loves open land. So if we look at its range map here, this kind of salmon color down into the purple, that's going to be its breeding and year-round range. If you look at it, that's where there's habitat like northern prairies, tundra, open ground. And then it comes down further south into the tall grass prairie states, into the eastern woodland states in the wintertime, but it is definitely an open country kind of bird. So it comes down here in the winter for food and water. It's often seen at dawn and dusk. So we think of most owls being nocturnal, awake strictly at night, or these owls are a little bit more crepuscular, and that means they're awake early morning and right before dark. So that's where we see most of our short-eared owls. They love grasslands and open ground, and they need large intact grasslands for their habitat. They need grasslands that are over 250 acres. They're probably not going to utilize small little 1 acre prairies quite as much as a large prairie. They're going to need that wide open space. Their mating begins in March, but most of our owls are in March or April in springtime, and their prey is primarily meadow and prairie voles. That's what they're going to be feeding on. Now let's take a listen to what our short-eared owl sounds like. So this owl isn't giving off hoots like our great horned or our barred owl. It has more of a raspy kind of bark almost. It almost sounds like a lion, a little lion cub baby trying to roar for the first time and trying to be fierce. So it's that raspy, nasally kind of bark. Let's listen to it one more time. You can see how this owl is sitting on looks like to be a fence post. When we do see short-eared owls here in Iowa in the wintertime, a lot of times they are sitting on something like a fence post or like a lone tree out in an area that has a little bit more open ground. I'm being a little clunky with my slides. I apologize. All right. From current slide. All right, next is our barn owl. So barn owl is a name that most of us have probably heard before. And the barn owl is state endangered, which means there is not a lot. It's a state of really special concern, has that endangered status, and we don't find a lot of them here in Iowa. And so Iowa is kind of on the northern tier of their range. So we're a little bit not in their best habitat, but they're also another owl that really thrives in open country and grasslands. So we have a picture of our barn owl here, and they're really famous for their heart-shaped white or cream-colored face. They usually have a white or cream-colored breast, and they have other reddish, rusty colorations in their body. They can really vary in their coloration. They're also really kind of known for their long legs. Here you can see how long and slender their legs are. They're going to nest in the hollows of trees and also in old barns, which gives them their name. So we think of like some of the early farmers with their old barns out in, like say, in prairie country. Those owls were utilizing some of those openings and gaps in the barns that they can make their nests in. Their mating begins in March, and like I said, they're dependent on grasslands, kind of like the short-eared owl. It loves eating meadow and prairie voles. So down here in the right-hand corner is this range map. The dark spaces, I believe, is its winter range, and the light kind of purple is its summer and breeding range. And then we have this kind of perforated dashed line that's kind of the top extent of where you might find them in the warm seasons. So Iowa, we're kind of in the northern part of it. The majority of the barn owls in Iowa are actually in southern Iowa. And they're not doing as well as they at one point in time did. So obviously they like grassland. So Iowa at one point in time was mostly prairie. So that was more favorable habitat for them. Even, up into the 1950s, our agricultural system had more short grain crops and things like alfalfa and hay, more grassy crops that these owls could utilize more. But with large row crops like corn and soybeans, that isn't a system that barn owls really thrive in. And let's listen to what our barn owl sounds like. And this one definitely does not sound like a hooting owl by any means. So our barn owl kind of has that screechy scream, right? So if I was out by some old barns at night and I heard that, I'd be pretty spooked if I didn't know what I was listening for. But not hooting, it's giving that screech, that shriek. Let's listen to it a little bit more. Cool. Now we have a few owl species left, and this next one is the snowy owl. And the snowy owl is a really cool white owl that we see in Iowa here once in a while. So we kind of call it an occasional winter visitor. Their primary habitat is way up north in the tundra, in a landscape that has a lot more snow on the ground. And you can really notice that by looking at its coloration. Majority of it is white, right? It's going to have some brown, gray, and black speckles and spots, and they can have variations in that coloring, but they have the coloration that they do so they can blend in with their habitat, which is mostly snowy, so they can hunt the food that they're looking for. And their primary prey is lemmings. So it's kind of like a rodent that you find that's a little bit more abundant up north, right? So that's really interesting about our snowy owl. Let's look at our range map here. So up here in the orange is its breeding, this purple is its orange, and the purple is its breeding and year-round range. This dark blue is its winter range. If you notice, Iowa's not really included in that. If you look at here, there's a little dash perforated line. That is its southern extent where these owls sometimes end up in the winter. And we call this owl an eruption species. And what an eruption is when we have our northern owls living up north. This one's eating lemmings. After a while, the owl population grows and the lemming population gets depleted because the owl's hunting them. So eventually, after every few years or so, kind of depending on the conditions, that lemming population will go down, and then we'll see snowy owls coming further south in search for food in the winter. So an eruption year would be a year where we are seeing snowy owls down here in Iowa. It doesn't happen every year. Typically, it's every 3-4 years, depending on the conditions in the lemming population up north. I have heard of one snowy owl report in our area this winter, so that's the only one I personally heard of. And what's kind of interesting about snowy owl species is that, at least in the wintertime when we here in Iowa, we see them usually in the daytime, sitting out at a fence post, or sometimes even in town on on light poles and different things like that. And let's listen to what a snowy owl sounds like. And a snowy owl is going to give a hoot. This owl actually hoots. It's a little bit gruffer. It kind of reminds me of the way I think my grandpa would try to imitate an owl. It sounds kind of gruff and kind of forced. Cool. That's our snowy owl. All right, and this is my last owl, our 9th owl that we're talking about. And this is the burrowing owl. This is a really rare visitor in Iowa. And where we're going to see this owl in Iowa is going to be extreme northwest Iowa. So this owl actually, instead of having its nests up in trees, it's going to nest on the ground. And they're not digging their own burrows. They're going to be utilizing the burrows of other animals. So when I think of burrowing owls, I think of them utilizing like abandoned badger burrows and holes. So they're really rare here in Iowa. They're kind of grayish brown. They have a white throat. Obviously, here's a picture of it sitting on a fence post. It has really long, kind of skinny legs. It's not a very big owl. Let me look here. It's about 9.5, 10 inches tall, so slightly bigger than our saw-whet and our screech owl. Fairly small. Its habitat is mostly open grassland, and it's going to like a little bit drier system than Iowa has. So Iowa at one time was mostly prairie, mostly tall grass prairie. We can find the eastern extent of burrowing owls in the tall grass prairie, but you're only really going to find them in extreme western Iowa, kind of the western bounds of the tall grass prairie system. So here is its range map. We have the orange, which is its breeding range. The purple is included in that, and it's its year-round range. And down into Mexico and other Central American countries as its winter range. They also do have a breeding population in Florida and some of the subtropics down there, which is kind of interesting. So their mating begins in February and March, so early spring. They nest in holes, maybe badgers, maybe by other creatures. Their prey is insects, small mammals, and we'll listen to their vocalization here in a second. But they do have a really interesting vocalization that mostly the young burrowing owls make, and it sounds like a rattlesnake rattle. So an adaptation that helps them scare away potential predators and harm, because they're not making their nests up in trees or on the ground. So they will be a little bit more susceptible to creatures walking around, right? And let's listen to what our burrowing owl sounds like. So the first one is its call. We can see it sitting here on the ground in a grassland system. So this owl is hooting as well, but it has its hoot sounds more like a cuckoo, right? Let's listen to it one more time. Cool. There's the burrowing owl. And this video is of burrowing owl doing its rattlesnake call. The thing I don't like about this video is this owl is clearly stressed out by whoever is videotaping it. It's a great representation of what the sound sounds like, but I would never encourage anyone to harass and pressure owls or any wildlife just for a good video. So take this one with a grain of salt, but let's listen to it. So the rattlesnake call, it's an aggressive hiss. It's a warning, says get away from me. And hopefully it's tricking some of those other animals that might be stumbling into a burrow that a rattlesnake might be in there. We might not all be familiar with what a rattlesnake rattle sounds like, but it's pretty similar to what we're hearing right here, right? So let's listen to it one more time. Very cool. That brings us to the end of the Owls of Iowa presentation. There are a few other species of owls that have been documented here in Iowa on extreme eruption years. There are other owls that are eruption species. There are some owls like the boreal owl and the great gray owl that have been documented here in Iowa during extreme eruption years. I think the last time was like 2004 or 5, that when they were documented here in Iowa. But I would encourage you all to go out and research those ones on your own. So once again, my name is Tony. I work for Jackson County Conservation. And if you're interested in any other things that Jackson County Conservation has going on, please visit our website at jacksonccb.com or go to the Hurstville Interpretive Center Facebook page. Sign up for a newsletter to hear all the news and happenings. One thing I didn't mention earlier is at Jackson County Conservation, we manage a number of public properties, campgrounds, parks, wildlife preserves, nature areas, conservation areas, and we have over 2,000 acres of public land that people can go out and utilize. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.